Hi, my name is Pat, and you are listening to the I Used to Think podcast, a podcast about people who are brave enough to change their mind. If this is your first time listening, welcome. For those of you who grew up in the United States, you may be familiar with the region of the country known as the Bible Belt. This is an area in the southern U.S. where conservative evangelical Protestantism highly influences both politics and culture. You'll find churches on every corner and hear country and Christian music everywhere you go. Church attendance is seen as normal or even expected. My guest today is very familiar with this culture. Mark grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is seen by many as a hub for conservative Christianity. Mark refers to this ideology as white American evangelicalism. According to Mark, this version of Christianity is characterized by moralism, patriarchy, and strict authoritarian structures. In today's conversation, Mark shares candidly about him and his family painfully left their church after experiencing the ugliness of white American evangelicalism. He gives us insight into how abuse is perpetuated and justified within many churches in the South. Mark passionately shares why he has dedicated his time to honestly blogging and podcasting about his experience. My hope is that Mark's story can help those of you listening who may have gone through church abuse or an uprooting of your own faith. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Hey, Mark, I appreciate you being on the show today. How's it going?
Thanks. Appreciate having me. I'm doing well.
We'll start with the icebreakers, and then you can go ahead and introduce yourself, and we can get to know you better.
Okay.
So for the icebreaker, you strike me as an avid reader, and I know you're a big Tolkien fan. My question today is, describe to me your reading habits. So I'll explain what I mean by that. I know for myself, I'll pick up a book, and I buy books perpetually. I'll pick up a book, and I'll read 15% of it, and then I'll stop because I get bored of it. And then I'll move on to a second book and read 15% of that one. And then that's just how I cycle through my books. And then I might go back to an older book. And then in addition, I usually never read the same book twice. So that's kind of the gist of my reading habits. I'm curious what yours are.
I read most nights. My wife is an avid reader too, so we read together most nights. Yeah, I normally have, I guess, like 3 or 4 books on my nightstand. I try to keep like one theology book, one church history book, and then something fiction. Normally something Tolkien related because I'm a super Tolkien nerd. But yeah, I read most nights. I read probably like 40, 50 books a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I have my TBR list is normally like 20 or 30 books. So I feel like perpetually behind.
In terms of how you read, do you wait till you've finished a book entirely before you move on?
No, I do. Normally the 3 to 4 I have on my nightstand, I'm in at once. I normally do only read one of those books a night, but yeah, I try to just keep it at 3 or 4, or otherwise I feel like I'm not making progress in my reading because I just have too much going on.
And then how do you decide whether it's worth buying another book?
When my shelf falls below like probably 15 books and it starts to look a little empty, I have a list I keep of books I haven't ordered yet.
Okay.
If I see like a book I'm reading, I see a citation about an idea that I've never heard about before, and I'm like, oh, it's interesting, and oh, look, there's a citation to a book that's just about this, and I'll add it to the list. As soon as my shelf starts to shrink, I keep an eye on what's on sale on that list and then go ahead and order it.
Okay. 50, you said 50 to 60 books a year?
40 to 50. So
okay.
My wife reads up to like 90 or 100, so she has me beat.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
That is very impressive.
It is. It's very impressive.
This is sort of related, but this is something that I struggle with when it comes to reading. And I've always been curious if other people think this way. When you go on vacation or a trip, how do you decide which book to bring?
Ooh, that's tough. So I normally bring whatever's on my nightstand, but we tend to go, when we do travel, we always kind of know where the local bookstore is or Barnes & Noble is or something like that. And normally we'll go and pick up 1 or 2 books when we're out of town, and I normally end up actually reading that one. And then the books I brought just stay in the bag.
Okay.
So very, very inefficient, but
that's relatable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Often when my wife and I travel, we'll go to bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the exact same thing. never end up reading the books we brought. We just buy another one.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Oh, well, I appreciate you entertaining that question. I'm really glad we've got to meet. We have a mutual friend who introduced us, and I listened to one of your podcast episodes. I know you don't release that frequently, but I mentioned before that I was very impressed by it. There are very few podcast hosts that I feel like balance well asking questions and then chiming in with their own thoughts, and I thought you did that very well.
Oh, thanks.
And
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and let you just introduce yourself. Who is Mark Hackett? What is Mark all about?
Yes. Hello, I'm Mark. I've lived in Memphis, Tennessee my whole life. Besides traveling either for work or pleasure, I've really had no desire to live anywhere else. It's a great city. Always encourage people to visit. Lots to do here. But yeah, also a lifelong Christian. Grew up in, I guess you'd say, the conservative evangelical world. It's a world I'm still around a lot, even though I don't really identify with it. Day job, I've worked in the nonprofit sector for, 11 years now. Like we were talking about before, I'm kind of in the very early stages of probably a career transition of some sort. Also married for almost 16 years, have 2 kids.
That's awesome.
So our house is very loud right now, but mostly in a good way.
Is your wife more extroverted and outgoing compared to yourself, or the opposite?
No, we're both introverted. I'm not nearly as introverted as I used to be, but we're both pretty introverted, which is why most nights we're just in bed reading books together.
That checks out.
Yeah.
And as far as your kids, do you have a good feel? I don't know how old your kids are, but would you say they're in contrast to your personality as far as extroversion?
Oh yeah. So our kids, our oldest, our son is 10, our daughter's 7. They both like to read too, that's great. But yeah, our son has actually got a little more introverted as he's gotten older, which has been interesting. I don't know if that's just getting older and approaching the awkwardness of middle school. Maybe that's part of it. I'm not sure. Our daughter is so extroverted that she makes up for all the introvertedness in the house. She does ballet right now and like perfectly fine being on stage in front of like 600 people at like the age of 7.
Amazing.
And just loves talking to people and smiling at everybody. And she's the exact opposite of us in a lot of ways. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
Cool. Let's get into the topic of today's episode. I'm really excited for this. One of the reasons I invited you on is because my show has slowly been trending towards this theme of evangelicalism, deconstruction. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce your topic. Mark, what did you used to think?
So I used to think the gospel was reflected in the church culture I was a part of, but now I think it mostly wasn't. And there's a lot of ways we could go with that. So I'll follow your lead. Your lead at this point.
Cool. I'll just bring up that one of the reasons your story stood out to me is because I'm in Southern California. And as you mentioned, you're in Memphis. Actually, I've never been to Memphis. I've been to Nashville and I've been to Chattanooga. I was in Nashville for our honeymoon. So that was my first time in the South, first time having true Southern food and going to country music concerts and all of that. You said your church culture, and as we discussed earlier before this, we started recording, that involves Southern church culture. So describe to us what that means, what that looks like, because I'm sure it's a lot different than here in California.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, clarifying what I mean by this is probably really important. So like I said, I live in Tennessee. You could argue this is the geographic headquarters of what's called white evangelicalism. The Southern Baptist Convention is headquartered here. A lot of the big evangelical music and recording artists are here, especially around the Nashville area. And politically, it's obviously a very red, very Republican state. There is some diversity of churches and Christians, for sure. But the most dominant church culture is of that very conservative, culturally white evangelical variety. The church culture here is very religious. It's very driven by having the quote unquote right beliefs and being around the right kinds of people. There's a lot of rules and expectations, a lot of moralism, some spoken very loudly, other rules are unspoken or more subtle. But it's often not very spiritual or communal. It's highly individualistic, very populist, and usually pretty emotional and dogmatic as well. I think maybe the most helpful way to describe, I guess, white evangelicalism here in Tennessee, it's a bit dated in how we talk about things today, but it's very much an honor shame kind of culture, which is something we definitely see all over the Bible. But the way that plays out is institutionally, power is concentrated at the top in these kinds of churches, virtually always with men. And the secondary layer of leadership beneath that, it largely exists to serve the desires and whims of pastors and elders. But for the person in the pew, I guess, people probably more like me and you, social standing, wealth, reputation, social connections, that's what determines what morality and behavior is and is not appropriate. What church leadership thinks of you, whether it's accurate or not, that's the thing that really matters. And to a lesser degree, what everyone else thinks of you too. But yeah, faith is much more about consuming, I guess, pre-approved products like books and articles and podcasts from evangelical and Republican names with big national platforms, and having specific political beliefs and expectations as opposed to following the teachings and example of Jesus. So your trajectory, the gifts you have, the calling God gave you, and your beliefs are more or less decided for you. There's a lot of peer pressure to conform to what everyone else is doing. That said, there are some exceptions to what I just laid out here in the South. The most obvious is the historic Black church, which, broadly speaking, has been the most faithful to the teachings of Jesus and the example of the early church really since the country's founding. There are also mainline churches with their politically and culturally mixed congregations that are much more communal than they are individualistic. And there are even some evangelical churches that do have a much softer touch to them. But yeah, the dominant church culture here, what I just described, it has more in common with the Roman Empire of Jesus's day
Okay.
than it does with what Jesus expects the church to be. And there are a few overlapping labels like white evangelicalism, Christian nationalism, patriarchy, that more or less encompass a lot of what I just described. But it really is like these honor shame elements are what's driving all of that.
It stood out to me that you characterized Southern church culture as individualistic rather than communal. What do you mean by that? And I think the reason I'm confused is because I grew up in a very evangelical environment that was quite dogmatic. And if anything, it was very tribalistic. So there was a clear tribe. So what do you mean by the fact that it's more individualistic?
Yeah, evangelicalism here is very tribalistic for sure. But it's individualistic in, I guess you'd say, the American sense of the term. It's very like libertarian. There's, you can meet a lot of Americans who don't like paying their taxes, for example. But there are evangelicals here tend to take that a step further and say like, well, I don't understand why I should have to pay for any of the stuff that they think doesn't directly benefit them. And that does play out in churches as well. This is why in a lot of evangelical churches, most of the money goes to paying for staff and buildings and things like that. And very little of it actually gets out the door to nonprofits or church members who are even trying to do good things in the community. So there is a community sense in that we evangelicals are in this together, but that's where it stops. There's little to no emphasis on like, well, what's happening in our city or our state or our country beyond maybe some sort of effort at like political or cultural control. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense.
Okay, cool.
And it helped that you clarified individualistic in the American sense, I think, especially in contrast to other cultures. One of the questions that came up when I was reading through your articles, which, by the way, for everyone listening, Mark has a great blog. Would you characterize it as a blog?
Sure. I don't know what it is. We'll call it that.
Okay.
It's a website. So.
Yeah, which I really like too, because I know, including myself, everyone's on Substack. So the fact that you created your own platform I think that's great. And one of the things that stood out to me is you used the phrase white American evangelicalism, which personally, I actually haven't come across. I've heard Christian nationalism, I've heard American evangelicalism, but never characterized by race. And so other than the obvious, which is most of the folks at these churches are probably white, how is white American evangelicalism different? Why does that need to be differentiated?
Yeah, so I would say two things, culturally and theologically. We can start with culturally because I think that's probably the most obvious. So I use the term white. I'm using that more in like a cultural sense, not necessarily the way someone looks. Because you can find in some white evangelical churches, you can find people who aren't white. But what white evangelicalism really stands for is some of the things I mentioned earlier, like patriarchy, a very moralistic approach to really just life in general, an emphasis on, quote unquote, being biblical as opposed to being Christ-like, which those are not necessarily always the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I mean by when I use the term white American evangelicalism, is this is very much a cultural, social, and political movement, more so, I guess you'd say, like a gospel-centered movement. And I think theologically too, things are. I mean, you mentioned you grew up in an evangelical context as well, so you probably have some familiarity with this, but theologically, things are very, very narrow, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't step off the beach towel. So if, for example, you are reading your Bible one day and notice Paul saying something about the nature of atonement that doesn't fit into very narrow, very individualistic approach to like penal substitution, which is the big Protestant atonement theory, and you start asking questions about that, people are probably going to get upset with you pretty quickly. And so this is really, I think, what sets a lot of white evangelicals apart from not just American culture or the communities they find themselves in, but also much of the rest of Christianity. Probably like you, I know a lot of other types of Christians, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox. I mean, I know lots of different kinds of Protestants, especially, and they have no issue talking about different approaches to theology and faith in everyday life and church history and all of these things. And those are the types of things you tend to be able to talk about a lot less in white evangelical settings. So that's what I mean by that. It is a very distinct culture, and when you're in it all the time, when it's the water you're swimming in, I guess it might be kind of hard to feel. Right. But if you're someone on the outside who steps into it, you're like, whoa, like what is all this? And the reason I can say that is, I mean, just in my day job in the nonprofit space, I've met so many people, Christian and otherwise, over the years, not just from all over the United States, but around the world. When they find out I'm in Tennessee, they always have questions about what things are like here. Religion tends to come up pretty quickly. And it's interesting, like even some conservative evangelicals I've talked to elsewhere in the United States or Europe, when I start explaining what the evangelical fold is like here, they tend to be very confused and sometimes even question if this is part of the Christian faith. So it's interesting. Yeah.
I guess I have the same reaction learning that you're from Tennessee.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I was curious about is I hear that in the Bible Belt, church is just a part of your week, that church and Christian music and CCM, contemporary Christian music, is just the dominant genre of music. Is there a outcasting that happens for people who aren't Christian, who don't subscribe to the Bible Belt culture, going to church every Sunday? Are they very clearly the minority?
I guess it depends on the context you're in. So like, let's say you're an evangelical in one of these churches and you start asking some questions. If you keep asking those questions, your time is probably going to be coming to an end in that space pretty soon. Whether it's a question about theology or maybe a bad decision was made in the church, maybe there was abuse in the church, and you're not even like accusing anyone, you're just asking questions about these things, like that tends to bring a crackdown onto your head pretty quickly. I think if you're maybe a different type of Christian or you're outside of this space, like you're still affected by all of this.
Okay.
Whether it's through state policy coming out of Nashville. There's two state reps here who I think it was last week introduced a bill where they want to be able to have the state of Tennessee execute a woman if she has an abortion.
Wow.
And a lot of views like that feel very extreme. A lot of those types of bills that get introduced are by elected officials who go to an evangelical church on Sunday. And so really if you live here, there's no way to fully escape this subculture, even if you don't go to an evangelical church on Sunday. Like even in your workplace, you're probably going to work with somebody who does.
Okay.
And of course, this doesn't mean that every evangelical is malicious or bad or, is out to hurt everyone. But, this is the water a lot of people swim in here. And because it is, it kind of feels natural.
What do the people around you think of California?
They don't like your governor very much, but no, again, a lot of it probably does have to do on what context you're in. I think if you walk into like a white evangelical church on Sunday, like most people probably aren't going to be thrilled with the idea of California. But I've been to California, I've been to San Diego and LA, and San Diego especially was just one of the coolest cities I've been to. But people who have traveled outside of the South, even travel does open up your view on the world. And I even know some evangelicals who have, once they've traveled outside the South, whether it's to California or on a mission trip abroad or whatever, they do come back with a little bit of a different perspective and realize like, okay, like, sure, maybe California is not my cup of tea, but I get, maybe they get the appeal a little bit.
Sure. Like I won't be offended because I have my qualms with California and I at the same time love my state.
Yeah.
I'll chime in here because growing up in Christian nationalism in California, there is a very strong sense of we're the remnants. We're the only ones left that decided to stay. And especially after 2020, when I knew folks who, I think they call them left UGs now. Left UGs.
Oh, I haven't heard of this. What is that?
Essentially just fleeing the left.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is a hard word to pronounce, but there was very much a sense of we're the only ones left. And so the Christian nationalists I actually meet in California, not all of them, but can be very dogmatic because they are basically always on guard, feeling as if they're constantly being attacked. So it's interesting that's one of the reasons I'm asking so many questions about church culture in the South, because I think in the county that I'm in, so I live in Orange County, which is where Disneyland is.
Yeah.
And Orange County is very churched. So Orange County is sort of an anomaly. I would say overall it's leaning slightly more conservative. But in general, being in California, you're probably not, if you're in a room of 10 people, maybe one person goes to church.
Okay.
Nominally.
Yeah.
If that, maybe less.
Yeah.
Which is just a completely different environment.
Oh, yeah. Here, again, it depends on kind of what context you're in, but it's probably going to be like the majority of the people you're sitting with go to a church of some kind, nominally or weekly. So, but no, you mentioned like some of the Christian nationalists in your neck of the woods are on guard, I think is the term you used. Like that, even though evangelicalism is very dominant here, like that mentality of being under siege, always having to watch out for like the next sin or evil that's going to try to walk through your church's door. Like that mentality still very much exists. And it's a very odd thing because it's almost like evangelicals here will take changes at the national level and make it feel like those changes are going to be inside their church within like tomorrow.
Oh, okay. I see.
And so this is why, especially I think you see this coming out of the Southern Baptist world, especially whatever the culture war topic of the day is, gay marriage, abortion, minority rights, there's a lot of things. Whenever there's like a law passed at the national level or talk about extending rights to a group that historically has been marginalized or oppressed, you see white evangelical leaders who identify with Southern states instantly freak out. And then a week later, the congregations are freaking out. Even though so So I grew up in like the early 2000s was when I was in high school. And I remember a lot of churches back then were, as there were talks about legalizing gay marriage, a lot of conservative evangelical churches were super concerned that they were going to have to marry gay couples now. And it was funny because it's like gay people like know what your church stands for. Like they don't want to be married to your church. Like what? Like why? Like
That's a good point.
Nothing's gonna change for you guys. Like this doesn't affect you at all. But you know, it's still people freaked out a lot about that for a few years.
Yeah, out here in California, we had Prop 8, and I think that made national headlines. And Prop 8 actually passed. And at that time, our church made a huge push, a campaign for, yeah, I think it was yes on Prop 8 was what my church was pushing for.
Okay.
And then the Supreme Court ended up ruling it unconstitutional, and all of the millions of dollars that got poured into Prop 8 was for naught. I realized we should probably define Christian nationalism because you and I already are, as you said before, swimming in these waters, so we have an idea of what that entails. But how would you briefly describe that?
Yeah, so I would mention first, there are a number of great books on this topic by experts who are far smarter than me. Maybe we can link to those in the show notes. One of them is called The Flag and the Cross, author Samuel Perry and somebody else. I'm forgetting. If you're listening to this podcast, don't be mad at me. I forgot your name. I mean, Christian nationalism is essentially a desire to bring together a very specific brand of I'd say cultural Christianity and enforce the expectations and rules of it onto the entire country. And the reason I say cultural Christianity is because you do have some like Catholic Christian nationalist. This isn't just like an evangelical phenomena necessarily. I think the evangelical variety is what you hear most about though, because it is the biggest and the loudest. But yeah, I mean, it is essentially like it's what we're living through now. We're going to take over governing institutions and media outlets, and we are just going to push this agenda we have onto everyone until everyone complies with it. Obviously, in a country as big and diverse as ours, like that's probably never going to fully succeed. Thankfully, there's just, I mean, between state and local, federal governments, just different kinds of churches, you have more and more just ordinary Christians who are pushing back against a lot of this stuff in their own communities. Mm-hmm. This is always going to be, at least the data I've seen is there is a pretty sizable minority of Americans who want to live in some form of a Christian nationalist state. But even in that sizable minority, there's disagreements and different desires on what policies should come first and who should be the politicians who make it happen and all that stuff. But thankfully, the Christian nationalist movement, to a certain degree, is a bit of a mess. There, in some ways, they are their own worst enemy. I think we're seeing a lot of that play out in Washington right now, unfortunately, even though a lot of people are getting hurt by it. But yeah, I mean, it really is that desire to take a specific set of beliefs and ideas about how culture and families and communities should work and just try to make everyone conform to it, or at the very least go along with it and not speak out.
Right. And I like that definition because you clarified cultural Christianity, which is, I mean, that's not even Christianity.
Sure. Yeah.
It's but it's the only way to really describe it.
Yeah.
Is cultural, or I guess nominal. I want to get into your own personal experience now, wherever you feel like it's best to start, as far as, you know, were you fully immersed in this, totally on board? You do have a really good article on this that I'll link in the description that you title Escaping White American Evangelicalism, which I think is the best succinct description of your story. But were you fully on board with this at one point and then you slowly got disillusioned, or how did that play out?
Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up in an evangelical church it was definitely politically and culturally conservative, but there was also I'd say like a high level of intellectualism in the teaching. And there was a heart for helping others in the congregation. So like, I'm the 9/11 generation. I didn't really see a lot of like the Islamophobia that many other evangelical churches were plagued with around that time and the several years after. You know, I remember growing up and asking questions about faith and God and things in the Bible that I didn't understand. And I was treated, you know, pretty kindly. And I felt like questions were encouraged. At least that was my experience. And knowing what I know now, though, that was pretty noticeably different from some of the harsher forms of evangelicalism that a lot of other kids my age were immersed in growing up. But, there was an emphasis on stricter gender roles. Purity culture was all the rage back then.
Did you have a purity ring?
I did not, and actually, I don't think that was part of the church I grew up in. At least I don't ever remember seeing them. So I guess that's a good thing, right? So that was my kind of upbringing. But after like a lot of kids who graduated high school, go to college, kind of start life, moved on from that church, and eventually landed at another church that kind of felt similar. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. I guess at that time, we're probably talking like early teens now. There was a sense among people my age who considered themselves evangelical that there were some not good things in our history, but it seems like, hey, some of those things are starting to be addressed. The really crazy voices and the religious right are, I mean, these aren't young people, like they're going to not be around eventually. So there was a sense that progress was becoming inevitable. Mm-hmm. And then 2016 just blew that false perception out of the water. I think the election of Donald Trump really created a permission structure in a lot of evangelical churches for a resurgence of some really ugly theology and really dangerous cultural expectations that are rooted in some of our country's oldest sins. I guess mostly like a more overt racism and patriarchy. But as that has continued to develop over the past 10 years, and it's become clear that this ideology never really went away. It just become, I guess, more quiet for a time because it was out of vogue to say and do certain things out loud. So, but yeah, I mean, through all that experience, I don't want to get bogged down in too many of the details. People can go read some of the more specific elements of my story. But, come 2019, 2020, it's pretty clear we're about to go through a pandemic and some sort of racial reckoning as a country. The church we were in, a lot of problems started coming out. Like this tends to happen in evangelical churches when one problem emerges and then all the other problems that have been swept under the rug kind of come out at the same time. This seems to be a very, very common story. So the church we were at, when issues of child safety came up, missing money came up, you have all the Trumpism and some of this ugly theology coming back around. This is all happening within like the course of 2 years. I learned during that time that saying and doing the right things, at least as far as how this culture identifies what the right things are, as soon as you start pointing to some of these problems and asking questions, who you are and what you've done with your life doesn't really matter at that point, because you're questioning people's basic assumptions about how the world does and should work at that point. And most people, evangelical or not, are going to like really freak out when you do that. Yeah. So I'd say, coming out of the pandemic, 2021, 2022, just kind of realized like I can't be a part of this world anymore. Yeah. And, I don't think I was ever fully on board with patriarchy. My wife and I have been married for almost 16 years. We've never had that kind of marriage. I was never really into Republican Party politics. I never really had an opinion on if women should be pastors or not, but it was just something I never really thought about, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I also wasn't completely blind my whole life either. Like, I saw things for years that I deep down knew were wrong or that I didn't understand. And I tended to just keep my mouth shut because I think subconsciously I knew that as soon as I started saying some of these things out loud and asking some of these questions, like, life as I knew it was pretty much going to be over. Sure. And I did have friendships that I valued and connections I had that I didn't want to let go of. And because of that, I did hang around in the system way longer than I should have. And so a lot of what I, write about is kind of coming to terms with all of that and what maybe the future for people who have been in similar settings, kind of what maybe some path forward looks like.
Yeah, reading your article is very heart-wrenching, I guess would be the best way to describe it. And there are similarities with my experience, but your experience is unique to you, and it's tough. It's I think especially because I think you've spent quite a few years in it, like you said, maybe sort of trying to make the best of it or staying in longer to be loyal. You give a couple examples in the article. I was wondering if you could just relay one of them where it was a moment where you realized, okay, the trust here is broken, both ways. I hope I'm not making you relive something too traumatic.
Oh, no,
But
no, you're good.
just to give listeners an idea, you've kind of hinted on like overarching themes of like problems with patriarchy and race, but what's an example of an encounter that sort of was the epitome of that?
Yeah, I think kind of the real breaking point for me, it was maybe like a month before the pandemic hit. And if anyone remembers what I guess January and February of 2020 felt like, it felt like it was a dark time for a lot of people. Like
Hmm.
everyone could see this kind of wave of something not good coming in our direction, even though we didn't really fully
Sure.
understand what it was. And so that's all happening in the background when, and all of these issues at the church we were at were kind of bubbling over at the same time. But I had a lot of concerns about child safety issues at the church. It had come to light that at least one kid had been physically abused. Thankfully, not super severely, but enough that it was like,
Hmm.
this is not good. And then maybe other kids had been as well. There was money missing from the church's Parents Day Out program, and there was no church elder overseeing any of that. And so it was pretty clear, like, best case scenario, the church just dropped the ball, like in the worst way possible. And as a young parent who had, a son in this program, like a lot of the parents in it, we obviously had some very, very real concerns. But
Hmm.
and I'd had conversations with the senior pastor who, to his credit, was actually really great through that. He was like, if you need something at 2 a.m, like,
Yeah.
call me.
Wow.
At the outset, the church had said, if your family needs counseling or any sort of assistance, like the church is going to pay for it. But as it became clear that the church had screwed up, a lot of that stuff started getting pulled back.
Oh, okay.
And so families that were finding out, like, oh, you have to file like a police report before you can access some of these counseling services. But it's also like, I don't know if my kid was abused, so I can't file a police report. And then certain people in their church kind of washing their hands, be like, oh, I guess we can't help. So there's a lot of stuff like that. But there was one elder in particular who I finally had it out with, because it was just like, the fact that no one's been held accountable at this point, it's been months, is like, this is insane. Like,
Hmm.
we're going to repeat the same mistakes if something doesn't change and people aren't held accountable here. And that ended in him accusing me of having problems in my marriage. And
Oh,
that's what
wow.
I was really ticked off about that. Not so much about kind of the state of the church. And that's when I realized, like, yeah, I've had some concerns for several years now about this church culture I'm a part of. Not even necessarily this specific church we were at, but just kind of evangelical culture more broadly. But it's like, this has gone from turn to some really dark stuff. like we're talking about the safety of children here, and I'm getting accused that the real problem is issues in my marriage that were non-existent.
Hmm. Yeah.
I like that's the response to all of this. So yeah, that's when I was just like, yeah, I can't be a part of this anymore. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Like, if this is what this church subculture is all about, like, count me out, and I don't really care what the consequences are at that
Yeah,
point.
of course. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we left that church and lost friends at that church, lost friends that were kind of attached to that church in other ways. The nonprofit I worked for lost quite a few donors through that, as well, as I kind of became more and more vocal about some of the issues that I was seeing in this kind of the broader church culture around me. But yeah, I don't, looking back, this was obviously several years ago now. Like, I think the only thing I would have done differently is probably left earlier. Like, I don't think I did anything perfectly, and I'm sure there's conversations I could have handled better. Maybe people I should or shouldn't have it talked to. Sometimes it's hard in the moment and when things are messy like this to know kind of what the best or right thing is to do. I mean, I've had people come to me, including from that church, even late last year, and tell me like, "Hey, I thought you were crazy, but like, I think I at least understand now."
Yeah.
And so, so I try to keep that in mind in all of my writing and podcasting. Like, I'm probably not going to convince like the hardcore Christian nationalists that what they're doing is at best less than helpful, at worst harmful.
Right.
But there are other people who are listening in and paying attention when some of these conflicts and conversations are happening. And even in evangelicalism, like, there are a lot of people who are very observant and pay attention when this stuff happens, even if they don't speak out themselves. And, after a few years of thinking of that, maybe a bad experience themselves, kind of come around and realize like, maybe this guy wasn't the problem that I was, or the threat I was told he was. So
It takes a lot of self-control to not say I told you so.
yes. Yeah, I went through that phase where there was a few times it was kind of like I kind of wanted to smack someone in the face, like verbally with the "I told you so." But I don't know. The further I've gotten away from it, and especially the less personal it's become in some ways, I'm much more inclined nowadays to just kind of listen to the horror stories that are coming out of this subculture and try to even share some of my own experiences to let people know, like, hey, like, what you're experiencing, I hate to tell you, but there's a lot of people who have gone through this already and still are, who have very similar experiences to you, and you're not going crazy by asking these questions. Like, you're actually doing what you should be doing and what Jesus taught his disciples to do when things go sideways.
After your wife and yourself decided, okay, we're going to leave, we're just going to cut ties. Now that you're churchless, what are the things you're looking for in your next church, which you may or may not be attending now? But I'm curious because all of this, I'm sure, kind of rearrange your priorities. Now you're not necessarily just looking for the good kids ministry. You're also looking for very specific, things in leadership and areas of safety. So what was your criteria list as you looked for a new church?
Yeah, so after that church, we left, and we were at that church for, gosh, at least 7 or 8 years. As a couple, I had been there a few years beforehand. We were out of church there was COVID, so we were out of church for like a year, like a lot of people were because of that. And near the end of that, when things started opening back up, we decided not to go back. We were at another church for about a year and a half. Some of the best people I've ever met. It was a multi-ethnic evangelical church. Like, I still talk to some people from there today who are just amazing human beings. But church leadership, not so much. Very, very much in the same variety of we can do no wrong. Like, it's our way or the highway. And so that church went through its own implosion that we were more on the margins of that time. But when it started happening, definitely saw all the red flags and warning signs that like, this is not going anywhere good. And so we were out of church for maybe another 6 or 7 months after that. And I was kind of just okay with continuing not being in church, but my wife really wanted to find something. And so I kind of just followed her lead on that. And so right now I guess for a little over 2 years now, we've been at a small Presbyterian church that, I'll be honest, is a little too evangelical for my taste. But it's definitely not what we've dealt with in the past either. It's, there is I feel like a new wave of kind of evangelical churches coming online now that are younger, that the people who have left the environments that we're talking about today are very much a part of and seem to have learned from a lot of those mistakes. So it's been good. I've kind of found my little niche in the church, I think. And our kids are happy and safe, which as a parent is, at this point, that's like 90% what what I want is just to make sure my kids are safe and, around people who care about Jesus. And I would say that the church we're at now definitely does that. But yeah, like, I mean, I feel like a lot of people who are kind of in my shoes, or it sounds like maybe a little bit like your shoes too, I'm definitely drawn to much older liturgical kind of models of the Christian faith now. Like I see a lot of beauty in Anglicanism and Catholicism, uppercase O orthodoxy.
Hmm.
Like I could see myself going in one of those directions at some point, but for now, at least, I think God's kind of put us where we're supposed to be, and I'm grateful for it. So,
Which Presbyterian denomination?
yeah, so it's PCA, which I'm not a
Okay.
huge. It's Presbyterian Church of America. I'm not a huge fan of the denomination. I know a lot of Presbyterians. Again, some really great people, but there are things that happen at the denominational level or in other presbyteries that just are like, we've been making the same mistakes for decades, guys. Like
Yeah,
maybe we
yeah.
should try something else. So,
Yeah, so
yeah.
I've attended a PCA for 5 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, two different PCAs. One thing I've learned being in the PCA is that West Coast PCA-ness is much different than probably what you're experiencing out there.
I would imagine.
Yeah, it's not a perfect church by any means, but
Yeah.
we've my current PCA has done a lot to help me, which has been good. I am curious, you brought up your blog and then your content and all the podcasts you've been releasing. What is your goal with all the content? Is it to change people's minds? You kind of already said you're probably not going to change the minds of those who are sort of in the extreme areas
Mm.
of politically and theologically. I know for myself, when I podcast and do these interviews and conversations and release Substack articles, a lot of it is just for my own healing. And I know that's been a
Yeah.
big part of it. Yeah, why would you say you're so driven and motivated to continue releasing content?
Yeah, I think so. Writing for me, especially, is how I process things. I've written privately for, gosh, since I was in high school, really. It's just kind of in my blood. It's part of who I am. And yeah, during, I guess, coming out of that really bad church experience, like during 2020, 2021, it's like, I'm just kind of curious, like, what other people think about some of the things I'm writing. Like, I feel like I'm going crazy. Am I going crazy? So I just started publishing some of it, and just through that, just the flood of emails and comments of like,
Mm,
I went through this exact same thing at this other church in like another city, and realizing like, oh, these like my story is really actually not that unique. Like this is happening all over the place. So, I do a lot of this is for kind of my own healing and journey. Because again, this is kind of part of who I am. This is how I process things. But
mm, mm.
I think it also realizing too, when I went through that experience, there were several months where I had nobody who could help me figure out like what went wrong, where where I needed to go next, kind of start processing all of that. And at that point, I had started writing and realized, that, okay, this is like part of a much bigger problem. It was around that time I read the book Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais, which I'm sure you're probably at least familiar with. And that book connected like it does for a lot of people, it connected a ton of dots for me. And I actually reached out to Kristen to thank her for writing the book, and through that started the podcast with her as my first interview. She's just such a brilliant and insightful woman. And yeah, I've just kind of kept going ever since. When I read something or hear someone help identify and define what some of these issues are in a way that I think really resonates with people, I'll either try to have that person on my podcast to just have them talk about kind of how they got into all of this and why they're writing about it, why they think it's important. And just in my own kind of reading and studying and stuff too, and what's in my own head, writing about some of that. Not to say I have all the answers, like I don't. I'm probably more uncertain about everything than I've ever been at any point in my life. But
Mm.
I do think putting some of this out there, probably in a similar way that you're doing it, you never know who's going to find something like this and be like, oh, wow, this is like exactly what I needed in this moment to
Yeah.
get me through the day, or to get me to leave this church, or to get me to try a new church.
Right.
Just because for so long I didn't have a voice, anything to rely on to figure some of that stuff out. I think it's really important for people who have been through this to offer that hand, whether it's just online or in real life, to others who are starting to go through stuff like this. So that's why I do it. But
Yeah, that's well said. And one of the few reasons I am grateful for the internet.
Definitely. Can you imagine if this was all happening and we had like no way of, I mean, especially me here in Tennessee, like I would have no way of hearing someone who's like Methodist or Catholic just because the way the church world works here. I would have no way to find another perspective without being able to go online and just find.
Yeah, I'd end up scribbling "help I'm deconstructing" on a piece of paper and just putting it on a pigeon and just sending it out into the world, and
Yeah, right.
maybe some charismatic will find it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I want to wrap up with if someone came up to you now after all of this and your story and what you've gone through, and they learned you're a Christian and they were curious about Christianity, and they're like, Mark, I'm curious. I want to be a Christian, or tell me more about Christianity. What is it all about? What would you say now that you've been through what you've been through?
Ooh, man, that's tough. I think I would probably just point to Jesus. Just say, listen to what he said. Look at how he treated people. Look at how he called people into repentance and repair. How he gave up everything for us and then overcame death itself. You know, the story of Jesus really sets a pattern for us to follow. I think going back to the problem in evangelicalism for a second, if there is a core theological issue you really wanted to nail down on, I think the evangelical or the white evangelical understanding of Jesus is probably where most of these other issues stem from. You know, this idea that Jesus died for me and my sins so I can get to heaven, that's not, I'm not saying that's wrong. I don't know what I think about the afterlife anymore, or at least as far as what immediately happens after we die. But this idea that Jesus essentially came here and died so I could get off this hellscape of a planet is just not like, that's just not an Old or New Testament idea at all. It just isn't. And I think what we really see in the four gospel accounts is Jesus laying out a pattern of how we are to live our lives and how we talk, how we walk, how we interact with other people. That's not to say that doctrine and creeds and beliefs, you know, don't have an important role to play. I think they do. But all these kind of extra things, they should be means to the ends, not the ends themselves. Mm-hmm. And when Jesus becomes the means and the ends, I think that's when we start seeing some of these problems go away. And I think it's, at least in our moment on the timeline, it's us taking one small step to seeing the beautiful picture we see in Revelation when heaven and earth are made one. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you on the certainty regarding the afterlife. That's something that's come up. It actually came up in the last podcast episode of my show. And at this point, I'm the shrug emoji. You know, I'm just kind of
me too.
It's tough, and it sounds like we're on very similar trajectories as well, because I have found much beauty in Catholicism and capital or Orthodoxy, and a lot of my friends in those traditions have helped me to heal quite a bit, while simultaneously not trying to convert me to Catholicism or Orthodoxy, which I really do appreciate. Yeah, this has been awesome. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that wasn't brought up that you're just itching to bring up regarding this topic?
I don't think so. I think we covered it's already been an hour. We've covered a lot of ground.
Well, yeah, it helps me. It helps me when you have things to talk about, because I do not like talking. So
okay.
Thank you for doing the heavy lifting.
Oh, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
How can people learn more about your work? Where can they find you, socials, or any of your content?
So the best place to find me is at my website. That's just markhackett.com. If you Google like Mark Hackett Faith or something, I'm sure I'll come up. I have a free newsletter that goes out once a month and includes the latest thing I've written about or guests I've had on the show. It also includes some of the books I'm reading and things like that. So that's a great way to keep up with me. I'm also on Instagram, markhackett.faith. And on Threads, just Mark Hackett on there. Yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And I will say that I checked out your merch store and I bought a t-shirt.
Cool.
So I'm going to give a shot. I'm going to, let listeners know to definitely check out that merch store.
That's great. I'm not looking to make money doing all of this, but, you know, being on the nonprofit salary, making sure the website gets paid for and stuff like that. If I need like a new microphone or something, that's how things get paid for. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, my pet peeve is terribly designed Christian merch,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is so prominent. I mean, if I see WWJD on another mug or bracelet, because that's the only thing Jesus ever talked about. Anyways,
Yeah.
thank you again, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I really enjoyed my conversation with Mark. I do recommend that you go check out Mark's newsletter. I'll put a link to that in the description. He sends it once a month and it has some great stuff in there. As usual, take the time to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, peace.